Today is April 14, 2023, 9 years after the abduction of our Chibok girls from their school by Boko Haram. From October 2022, it is the fact that although 276 girls were abducted 9 years ago, 57 of them have since escaped, 107 were released, 16 of them were rescued by the military. Of these escaped, released, and rescued, 12 are said to be still in the custody of Borno State, yet to be reunited with their families. And sadly, 96 young women are still in captivity. So today, I will read this paper that became a book chapter in Daughters of Chibok, edited by Aisha Muhammed-Oyebode. The chapter is titled The Chibok Girls, Structural Violence, Gender and Education in Nigeria's Northeast. I'm Mojuba Olufunke Okome, Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College. So here's my introduction. In the chapter, I argue that the best explanation for the plight of the poor, including our Chibok girls in Nigeria, is the pervasiveness and depth of structural violence, which denies them of human security. Human security, as used in this chapter, is drawn from the ideas of Johann Galtung, particularly his 1969 publication. Although structural violence is pervasive in Nigeria, there are gendered, religious, class, and regional variations of structural violence that cause more or less marginalization. This is why girls born into poor families are affected to a greater degree, because they are already marginalized by the combined consequences and prevalence of extreme poverty, and the gender-based discrimination that causes bias against girls' education and toward more responsibility for housework and caregiving, as well as early marriage, all phenomena that are ubiquitous in Northeastern Nigeria, a region with some of the lowest socioeconomic indicators in Nigeria, which has also been embroiled in conflict. This conflict has since spread to northwestern and also central Nigeria. The lackadaisical, nonchalant, and disorganized response of the Goodluck Jonathan administration in initially ignoring the news that on April 14, 2014, close to 300 girls had been abducted from Government Girls Secondary School in Chibok can also be attributed to structural violence. President Muhammadu Buhari's administration came into office vouching to rescue the Chibok girls, to end conflict in Nigeria, and to revive the economy. It is also a consequence of structural violence that 96 Chibok girls to date remain in Boko Haram captivity, and over 100 girls were abducted from Government Girls Science and Technology College, another boarding school in Dapchi, on February 19, 2018. On March 21, 2018, All but one of them were released. The one that wasn't released, Leah Sharibu, is still being held by Boko Haram, allegedly for failing to convert to Islam. Structural violence is responsible for the Nigerian public's lukewarm response to both Chibok and Dapchi abductions, and the prevalence of the belief that the Chibok abductions was a ruse. Had the Bring Back Our Girls campaign not captured international attention and received support from prominent personalities who were widely covered in traditional and social media, there probably would have been scant attention paid to the abduction. The tendency would have been to assume that even if the girls had been abducted, it was impossible to rescue them because they were deliberately married off and scattered all over West Africa by their abductors. Finally, I attribute the gross inequality in educational access and quality of education offered in Nigeria to the entrenched nature of structural violence and its effects on the body politic. So what is structural violence? Johann Galtung, who blazed the trail in conceptualizing structural violence, defines violence as follows, and I quote, "Any avoidable insult to basic human needs and more generally to sentient life of any kind, defined as that which is capable of suffering pain and enjoying well-being. Violence lowers the real level of need satisfaction below what is potentially possible. Violence to human beings hurt and harm body, mind, and spirit. Hurting or harming one of them usually affects the other two through psychosomatic transfers. Violence breeds violence within and among actors in space and over time. Violence leaves deep wounds, trauma that is difficult to heal. Violence to the mind takes the form of distorted cognitions and emotions, and to the spirit, the form of hopelessness, possibly because a meaning-producing project failed. Threats of violence are also violence, as insults to mind and spirit, creating distortions and hopelessness through fear. The object of violence is any carrier of life, particularly a human being, an actor, individual or collective, that is group or country. The subject of violence can be any actor, as in intended actor or direct violence, or a structure at work, churning out harm, causing basic human deficits, as in unintended, indirect, or structural violence, or culture at work when used to legitimize direct and structural violence. The legitimation then being indirect, direct, indirect, or cultural violence. Or it can be nature at work, like a tsunami, but then not always avoidable. This is from Galtung and Fisher, 2013. Now, structural violence affects all Nigerians, although to varying degrees. Some Nigerians are somewhat shielded by their wealth, status, connections, and position in the social hierarchy than others who are left to their own devices, marginalized and abandoned by the powers that be, who even take offense when such marginalized folks ask for justice, for equality and basic rights of citizenship that the powerful take for granted as they do. This is the tragedy of Nigeria, a tragedy made more profound by the rampant lack of awareness and nonchalance among the citizens of their rights in a supposedly democratic system. It has become routine and unremarkable for citizens to expect the state to guarantee their safety, security, and well-being. Since this guarantee is a constitutional provision, it is shocking that it is ignored so blatantly. The absence of such guarantee and its extension only to the powerful is a violation of the Constitution and a symbol of structural violence. The relationship between the Nigerian state and citizenship shape gender relations. Political terror and violence are part of the tools used by the state to impose order. Political terror is also being used by insurgent forces that have abducted and kept the Chibok and Dapchi schoolgirls and other Nigerians in captivity. Boko Haram is an exemplar of patriarchal nationalism because it uses gender norms that consider women to be mere vessels for procreation and men as combatants. The abduction of the Chibok girls and hundreds of other women and girls for use as wives, sex slaves, and unpaid labor for domestic work is due to their desire to regulate women's reproduction and labor. So following Caprioli's 2005 work, it is clear that structural violence produces a prevalent, and I quote now, domestic environment of inequality and violence. Structural and cultural violence results in a greater likelihood of violence at the state and the international level. Although there are constitutional guarantees of state obligations to prioritize citizen security, violent insurgents are able to act with impunity. They are able to prey on the poor to a greater extent because the wealthy are able to buy security, sometimes using organized ethnic vigilantes, sometimes sophisticated high-tech mechanisms, and sometimes both. The middle class pulls together resources to do the same. The poor are unable to do this, and they suffer the consequences. Boko Haram abductions are an example of how poor Nigerians are at the mercy of bandits and insurgents due to state inability and or unwillingness to protect them. The Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria is caused by structural violence, produced by an admixture of what I described in previous work as, quote, frustration arising from inequality, discrimination, rebellion, and relative deprivation, and the ability to finance rebellion. There are increased incidences of conflict in Nigeria. The Nigerian social order is rife with exploitation and marginality. Despite becoming Africa's largest economy in 2014, Nigeria is one of the countries with the largest percentage of its population in poverty worldwide. As the third-ranked state for these indices, it follows India at number 1 and China at number 2. There is an extreme level of inequality in Nigeria. Aliko Dangote, with an estimated net worth in 2020 of 12.2 billion, is one of Africa's richest people. Actually, this indicator is from 2018. And the lifestyles of the Nigerian rich and famous favor a grand flaunting of wealth amidst the majority's misery, given that approximately 70% of Nigerians were living below the poverty line in 2007, according to UNICEF. Compounding the challenges of human security in Nigeria, the country does not have a welfare state. Thus, there are no safety nets for the poor and marginalized. The poor, marginalized, and exploited majority are beset by ethnic, religious, and sectarian divisions that generate conflict and prevent their unification. Unlike the wealthy and middle class, they are unable to deploy the resources required to protect them from violence in a system where such necessities are privatized, and state security forces are capricious, corrupt, and violent towards the poor, and deferential, protective, and respectful towards the wealthy. The poor majority have little or no stake in the existing system, making it more logical for some to join Boko Haram and similar violent insurgent groups that claim to want to destroy the system and place a better one and put a better one in place. Structural violence can cause alienation and repression. It negatively impacts survival, wellness, freedom, and identity. It has visible manifestations on the body and less visible manifestations on the mind and spirit. It can impede consciousness formation and mobilization, two conditions for struggle against exploitation. It can involve, quote, penetration, implanting the top dog mind inside the underdog, combined with segmentation, giving the underdog only a very partial view of reality. Will impede consciousness formation. Fragmentation, keeping the underdogs away from each other, with marginalization, keeping the underdogs on the outside, will impede mobilization, unquote. This is also from Galtung and Fisher, their 2013 publication. Structural violence can be vertical in situations where, as a result of socially constructed hierarchies, it is that normalize much more to some and much less to others for their basic human needs. Applied to gender relations, it informs the normalization of patriarchy. Finally, structural violence can be horizontal, quote, where the person is trapped equally and equitably in a web of horizontal structures so tight that no individuation is possible, unquote. Again, from Galtung and Fisher, 2013. Although primarily focused on healthcare disparities in Haiti, what Paul Farmer said about Haiti fits very well the Nigerian situation. And here's what he said in quote, poverty, crime, accidents, disease, death, and more often than not, their causes are also seen as problems locally derived. The transnational tale of slavery and debt and turmoil is lost in the vivid poverty, the understanding of which seems to defeat the analysis of journalists and even many anthropologists, focused as we are on the ethnographically visible. What is there in front of us? That's from Farmer 2004. So penetration, segmentation, fragmentation, and marginalization are all evident in the Nigerian socioeconomic structure. The Chibok abduction was possible in the first place because it has become routine for security to be available to the top dogs who can buy it in Nigeria. And also, due to state laxity in attending to the security needs of the underdogs, the report that there would be insurgent attacks on schools was ignored, and hundreds of girls were put in danger in 2014 and in subsequent years when there were kidnappings. The insurgents pretended to be state security agents and were dressed as such. The Chibok girls suffered direct as well as structural violence and psychosomatic effects, including injuries to the mind and psyche as a result of their abduction. Despite the experience of the Chibok, Dapchi, and other abductions, there is no generalized established protocol for the Nigerian educational system that prepares students and staff for responding to violence in schools. Let us imagine what it must have been like for our Chibok girls who were in school to take an examination on that day. In the middle of the night, they were abruptly and violently abducted. Their school was burnt to the ground, and all of them were loaded in Hilux trucks, summarily carted away by a band of insurgents. It took 3 weeks for the government of Nigeria to be harangued into making a feeble response. 53 girls, the first group to be freed from Boko Haram captivity, had to use their own imagination and determination to escape from their abductors. 96 of these young women remain in captivity overnight, and it's 9 years today that abduction happened on April 14, 2014. It is shocking. It's devastatingly destructive. The kind of violence that was inflicted on them, their families, and their communities. The violence they experienced is even more profound because it's structural in nature. Now I will speak about education. Penetration, segmentation, fragmentation, and marginalization also affect education. Education is widely recognized as a key driver of change due to its multiplier effects on the lives of individuals, communities, and the world at large. More importantly, education is a fundamental human right. Education makes it possible to exercise other human rights. It contributes to individual freedom and empowerment, and ultimately to development, according to UNICEF. This right is recognized in many international conventions, including the 1966 International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in which Articles 13 and 14 refer to free compulsory primary education and to the development and accessibility of secondary education, as well as to equitable access to higher education. This is according to the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commission, 1966. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, 1960 UNESCO Convention Against Discrimination in Education, the 1981 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, the 2006 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. There are also provisions in Nigeria's 1999 Constitution and the 2004 Compulsory Free Universal Basic Education Act, Section 2, Part 1, for the right to free education at both primary and secondary levels. This was confirmed in Legal Defense and Assistance Project versus the Federal Ministry of Education and the Attorney General of the Federation. Given the multiple bases and just plain common sense rationale for funding, supporting, and providing excellent education for all, is emblematic of the depth of structural violence because it is accepted in the Nigeria that we live in today that the wealthy can access excellent education because they can pay for it. The poor only have access to education under extremely dismal conditions. Nkechi Catherine Onwunameze shows that there is considerable wealth gap in education in Nigeria, and that, quote, family wealth, parental education, and region explain differences in academic achievement. Family wealth was found to be the most important variable influencing achievement in reading and numeracy, followed by mother's education and then region. This is in her work from 2013. Thus, the potential for poor children's self-actualization and reaching their human potential are deeply constrained by social, economic, and political structures. Education is one of the most reliable means to economic advancement for the marginalized. Women's education is also widely acknowledged to be an avenue towards upward mobility for the woman as well as her children. Global consensus also exists that there should be equal and equitable access to education. So we have this situation where even under the best of circumstances, due to inequality, the poor tend not to have equitable access, and there's no equality between poor and wealthy in most educational systems. In Nigeria and most other developing countries, the magnitude of the divide is extraordinary. The poor quality of education can be attributed to lack of genuine commitment by the state, which then manifests in students' lives as they're being taught by poorly paid and poorly trained, overworked, and under-resourced teachers. And they lack well-equipped facilities, they lack good curricula and assessment that is geared at improving teaching and learning. There are also barriers caused by gender, poverty, place of residence, ethnicity, religion, and displacement due to natural disasters or war or conflict. Human agency matters, but it can be limited by structuration, that is, the structural factors that order possibilities. The parents in the Northeast who have made great sacrifices and bucked the trend of not educating girls tacitly recognize the role of education in girls' and women's empowerment. They want a better future for their daughters. The girls who embrace education are also hopeful that they can thereby become skilled professionals and leaders in their communities. The Chibok and Dapchi abductions have a chilling effect on the hopeful aspirations of these parents and girls. Structural violence characterizes the situation in Nigeria. A gendered analysis reveals the nature, form, and effects of structural violence on socioeconomic relations and on the security threats facing girls. The ways governments, humanitarian organizations, civil society, and the international community address the safety, well-being, and rights of girls traumatized by poverty and extreme inequality leave much to be desired. Boys and men also have been subjected to Boko Haram-inflicted violence in Nigeria, but the focus here is to employ a gendered lens and structural violence framework to examine the Chibok girls' abduction, arguing like Caprioli that, quote, societal level discrimination and violence against women may have far more deleterious effect on society in increasing the likelihood of internal conflict. This is Caprioli, 2005. Gender politics in this view may cause the emergence of a situation where cultural roles, quote, the cultural roles assigned to women and overall impact of gender, unquote, could lead to, quote, intrastate violence and conflict. Many Nigerians' lukewarm response to the Chibok and Dapchi abductions should be seen as part of the effects of structural violence. This is indicative of the depth of penetration when the top dog mind is implanted in the consciousness of the underdog and the effects also of segmentation, because underdogs have only a very partial view of reality, and fragmentation, which keeps, quote, the underdogs away from each other, and marginalization, quote, keeping the underdogs on the outside and impeding mobilization, according to Galtung and Fisher, 2013. So many middle-class and wealthy Nigerians, even those who originate from Northeastern Nigeria, do not identify with the poor marginalized masses. Those who are not from the Northeast consider these places to be far away. They're people inscrutable, ignorant, prone to making suboptimal choices. President Goodluck Jonathan even claimed that going to Chibok would not lead to the Chibok girls' release, and that the service chiefs had gone there and were in charge of the rescue. This explanation was given after criticism of his administration by a top US defense official, and in Paris at a press conference, and not in Nigeria in answer to demands made by Nigerian citizens. President Jonathan only met with the parents of the Chibok girls after Malala persuaded him to do so when she visited Nigeria for her 17th birthday. Upon taking office, President Buhari promised to rescue the Chibok girls, and soon after, he met with the representatives of the parents and community, as well as with Bring Back Our Girls activists. The warm relationship cooled considerably thereafter, although the Buhari administration's response to the insurgency and abductions is more organized and has succeeded in securing the release of more Chibok girls and all but one of the Dapchi girls, Leah Sharibu. Now, let me talk about poverty, education, and structural violence, and the gender issues imbricated in all of them as my possible pre-conclusion. So the social and economic aspirations of poor and wealthy Nigerians differ remarkably. So does their capacity to achieve self-actualization. This is due as much to structural violence as to other idiosyncratic variables usually are assumed to be at play. Latin American liberation theologists applied Galtung's framework to local conditions, and they illuminate the domestic and international structural basis of many of the causal relationships between what is often considered enigmatic, inscrutable, or attributed to individual human wickedness and local corruption and kleptocracy. Instead, they show that immoral and unethical social structures where there is entrenched grinding poverty and deep social inequality, racism, and gender inequality are characteristic features of systemic structural violence. According to Farmer, structural violence is violence, and I'm quoting now, exerted systematically, that is, indirectly, by everyone who belongs to a certain social order. Hence, the discomfort these ideas provoke in a moral economy still geared at pinning praise or blame on individual actors. In short, the concept of structural violence is intended to inform the study of the social machinery of oppression. Oppression is a result of many conditions, not the least of which reside in consciousness. We will therefore need to examine as well the role played by the erasure of historical memory and other forms of desocialization as enabling conditions of structures that are both sinful and ostensibly nobody's fault. The degree to which people can fight back against such infernal machinery or its symbolic props has been the subject of much discussion in anthropology, unquote. Do ordinary people have any agency to resist, fight back, and transform their lives in a positive manner? Of course, poor people have agency, but it is facile and inaccurate to believe that this means that they have power equal to those of the dominant in oppressive and violent systems that are designed to marginalize them. Often, the choice that people exercise amounts to satisficing rather than optimizing. That is, they settle on an option that is less than optimal rather than hold out for the optimal option. Thus, valiant struggles do not necessarily produce desired systemic change. Also, there are clear winners and losers in the system, and the wins are skewed favorably towards the wealthy, whether it concerns personal security, human security, or educational outcomes. So now I come to structural violence and, how we look at education in Borno State. According to UNICEF, 40% of Nigerian children aged 6 to 11 do not attend any primary school within the northern region, recording the lowest school attendance rate in the country, particularly for girls. Despite a significant increase in net enrollment rates in recent years, it is estimated that about 4.7 million children of primary school age are still not in school. This is by 2007. The numbers have increased exponentially. In 2 northern Nigerian states, the gender disparity in education is as high as 1 girl to 3 boys. This is also from 2007. The latest Education for All assessment shows that primary education has stagnated in Nigeria. Some schools in northern Nigeria also have 200 teachers to 200 students to 1 teacher, according to UNICEF in 2014. And Nigeria is one of the countries where the difference in youth literacy rates between rich and poor is more than 50 percentage points. Nigeria has one of the highest rates of out-of-school children in the world. And the numbers have increased since the UNESCO figures that I have given so far. As a matter of fact, some of the statistics contemporarily is that over 20 million children are out of school, although these figures are hotly disputed. Now, conflict has contributed to some of the increase, and at least 20% of Nigerian children of primary school age might not enroll at all, according to UNESCO 2014. Nigeria also has a female youth literacy rate of just 38%. And even those who do attend school fail to attain basic literacy. So these girls fail to achieve basic literacy skills because of the poor quality of education that they receive. Almost 80% of young people aged 15 to 24 who left school after 5 to 6 years could not read a full sentence, according to UNESCO 2014 report. Also, quote, rich boys already complete primary school, but it may be another 3 generations before poor girls do, unquote. More distressing still, quote again, in Nigeria, while universal youth literacy has almost been achieved for the richest women aged 15 to 24, their poorest counterparts will need to wait 70 years to realize this fundamental right if no active steps are taken to fight illiteracy among the most disadvantaged groups, unquote. Also, quote, in Nigeria, only 14% of poor youth are literate, compared with 92% of rich youth, unquote. Again, another quote. Disadvantages in acquiring basic skills are further compounded by a combination of poverty, location, and ethnicity. The outcomes are clearly gendered. In Nigeria, only 2% of poor young women in the Northwest can read, compared with 97% of rich young women in the Southeast. Also, a British Council report on girls' education in Nigeria said the following, quote, many girls fail to make the transition to junior secondary school for a range of educational, economic, and socio-cultural reasons. An overage start to school, the onset of puberty, or increased cost of education, of secondary education, may all put an early end to girls' education. Girls' low levels of transition and retention in junior secondary schools is becoming an increasing concern because it implies that girls will continue to fail to acquire fundamental life skills, including literacy and numeracy, unquote. According to UNESCO, These outcomes, quote, may reflect the combined effects of poverty, isolation, discrimination, and cultural practices. However, they also echo failures of educational policy to provide learning opportunities for the most disadvantaged populations. And they indicate an urgent need to provide these people with a second chance. It is no wonder then that UNESCO considers the first 10 years of the 21st century a lost decade for Nigeria. Nigeria has a serious problem with out-of-school children. States in northern Nigeria are even more challenged in this respect. In addition to issues of school access, family and school resources, and attitudes towards education, school attendance in northern Nigeria is impeded by the increasingly brazen extremism of Boko Haram and its targeting of girls' education. The group has claimed to oppose the Western-style education associated with formal schooling in Nigeria, and it seeks to relegate women exclusively to the household. Many girls and young women are especially disadvantaged, and they remain marginalized in literacy as well as access to education. Indeed, in many northern states, more than 50% of young women ages 15 to 24 have no experience at all of formal education. Armed conflict worsens the situation in gender-specific ways. Quote, of the 28.5 million primary school age children out of school in conflict-affected countries, 12.6 million live in sub-Saharan Africa. The vast majority, 95%, live in low and lower middle income countries. Girls, who make up 55% of the total, are the worst affected, unquote. This is also according to UNESCO 2014. The significant inequity in access to education and the dearth of quality of education is further complicated in northern Nigeria by the fears that students, especially girls and young women, could be abducted by Boko Haram, as happened to the Chibok and Dapchi girls, or they could be killed, as with the young men in Buniyadi. There have also been other abductions. For example, in Lagos State, thankfully, those children were rescued. In Borno State, the female, quote, secondary school net attendance rate is only 29% in comparison to a national average of 58%, which is bad enough. An additional 18% of secondary school age girls attend formal school in Borno, but at the primary level. These girls may benefit from exposure to schooling, but they are behind for their age and at greater risk of dropping out. A further 7% of secondary school age girls attend non-formal programs, unquote. This is Hatch 2012. While one must admire the braveness of parents, as well as the grit and tenacity of the 54% of secondary school age girls who are still enrolled in formal and informal schools, we should worry about the 46% of secondary school aged girls who are not getting either formal or informal education. These problems have solutions. There are tried and true policies that have been demonstrated to work in other countries. An example is to prioritize and meaningfully implement policies that are equitably that equitably redistribute the gains from economic growth. According to the Education for All Monitoring Report, quote, the benefits of this growth have not yet been fairly distributed, however. Nigeria's economy, for example, grew by at least 5% per year since 2003, but its net enrollment ratio has fallen from 61% in 1999 to 58% in 2010. To guarantee their citizens' rights to education and tap into education's power to transform lives, it is vital that countries put in place strong fiscal policies backed by budget policy reforms to allocate an adequate share of public spending to education and promote equity in its distribution. This is according to UNESCO 2014. So now I have reached the conclusion. The Chibok girls' abduction, while tragic, was avoidable. The haphazard, uninspiring state response to their rescue epitomizes the entrenched nature of structural violence. Less value is attached to the lives of poor, marginalized Nigerians by both state and society. Those who advocate for equity in state response can be dubbed unpatriotic enemies of the state and their voices suppressed, as was done during the Goodluck Jonathan administration and to a lesser extent by the Muhammadu Buhari administration towards the Bring Back Our Girls coalition. There is clear evidence of structural violence in Nigeria. As mentioned above, it produces alienation and repression, negatively impacts survival, wellness, freedom, and identity. It affects the body in physically observable ways and has invisible but long-lasting effects on the mind and spirit. Lack of consciousness formation and mobilization that would have enabled marginalized populations in Nigeria to organize and struggle against exploitation can also be attributed to structural violence. There is evidence of penetration and the marginalized acting out their belief that their interests are the same as those of the people who oppress them. There is segmentation because the marginalized have very limited grasp of reality in terms of the forces that oppress them. There is obvious fragmentation because ethnic, regional, religious, gender, and other divisions keep the marginalized people from uniting against their common oppressors. And marginalization excludes them from the benefits of the system while empowering their oppressors to access these benefits as a right. The effects of structural violence make forces like Boko Haram appealing to part of the marginalized population who neither have a stake in the system nor see any prospect of change that would benefit them. Education, gender relations, availability of physical and human security, and access to the benefits of economic growth are all affected. Resistance, when it happens, is sporadic and it could be violent. It does not solve the problem because the vertical and horizontal structures that constrain individuals and groups remain, causing the state and its agents to act in a predatory manner towards the marginalized and in a conciliatory manner toward the elites. Redistribution and reorganization of economic, social, and political power in a democratic manner is the solution. But this is a huge challenge, not only in Nigeria, but worldwide. That it is a challenge does not mean that it is impossible However, great, consistent, tenacious effort must be made to weaken the basis of structural violence. Education is as important as national security. Investment in education yields significant benefits to individuals, families, communities, and countries. Part of the investment must include providing decent infrastructure, books, and other necessities, qualified, skilled teachers, reducing the proportion of students to teachers, and ensuring the safety and security of students. Since girls and young women are marginalized, corrective policies and programs must be implemented to ensure equitable access. Thank you.